It is Sabine Kleinert. She is a senior executive editor at The Lancet, where she is a member of the senior management team of the Lancet Group with responsibilities for research integrity, publication ethics, and open access policies. She initiated preprints with The Lancet in partnership with SSRN as one of the first medical preprint offerings. She served as vice chair of the Committee on Publication Ethics between 2006 and March 2012, and she has been involved in the organization of the World Conferences on Research Integrity as board member from their very beginning in 2007. So it is an honor to have you here. Another surprise for you now, Lex.
Thanks very much. Some of you might wonder, what was that all about? Let me just explain to those of you who have not been at the World Conferences on Research Integrity in Cape Town. That was the music to which all the speakers had to come up to the stage. And when Lex heard that for the very first time, I sat next to him in the front row. He was about to jump up, run to the guys in the back and say, "They must stop this, they must stop this." So I said to Lex, relax, relax. We're in South Africa. Things are different here. And by the end of the conference, you won't believe it, but Lex actually danced up to this.
So Sabine, before you begin, one quick question for you too. I presume you've been in many, many meetings with Lex. Have you ever experienced Lex sort of slacking or dozing off in any of these meetings?
No, absolutely not. Never.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So we're coming to what journals or editors can do, or should do, I would say, to strengthen responsible research practices. Before I start to give you my take on what journals or editors can or should do, I want to say, though, that I'm speaking very much from a kind of very privileged position of a professional journal with 270 members of staff for our Lancet journals, our 24 journals. The editors are all either medically qualified or PhD scientists with a lot of knowledge. So this doesn't go for all journals, and we can have some discussions on journals in general, perhaps during the question and answer session. But I very much talk about what we do and what we think should be done. So I will go through 4 things that editors can do to strengthen responsible research practices. So we can screen for or improve sloppy research, and ideally we want to improve research. We can act as guardians, or we should act as guardians of the scientific record, and that's where misconduct or errors come in. And I talk a little bit about that because it's important for us to act on these too. And then editors can be educators of researchers. We can contribute to the education that we've heard of this morning already in a different way. We are sort of very much at the end of the process, obviously, but we can still educate. And then I would like to have this last bit on open science as the solution with a question mark. And I will be a little bit provocative then, you'll see. So what do editors do now? We take everything authors tell us on trust in general. We're not there to look at their raw data. We're not there in checking all, contracts and ethics approval documents. But what most editors now do is they screen for image manipulation to see either, what would be misconduct or slightly improved images where we just say, no, give us your original image. What they also do is every paper that gets submitted to us runs automatically in our submission system through Authenticate. And the main result of this, and us telling authors that this is what's happening, I haven't seen a plagiarism case in years now. So it's preventive. And I think for that, it's a good practice. What we also do, we look very much for positives, like, is there ethics approval? Is there informed consent? In trials, we actually check physically as editors, is the registration ahead of the recruitment. So we not only ask authors that, we would also go to the clinical trials registry and look at the date of registration and then of the date of start of the trial. And we look at adherence to guidelines. And Malcolm has said this morning that this didn't make a difference when the authors ticked reporting guidelines. And yes, I agree totally, because that's not enough. They always tick everything or say page such and such. So we as editors go through every line when they say they have reported this on page 6. We go and find it. And very often you don't find it. And then we say, this must be there in the next round. We also look at the adherence to the protocol. This is again for clinical trials. All clinical trials have to have a protocol. They have to submit it with a submission to us in full. And if it's in a different language, that needs to be translated into English, because this is also what our reviewers will see. But as editors, as a first step, we would go to this protocol and look at, have these authors really done what they said they would? Have they reported this trial in full? Have they given us all the primary outcomes? And it's very interesting because even at that stage, before sending it to peer review, you find a lot of papers that don't do that. They either present just one primary outcome if there are 2, and then you worry that the second one was perhaps negative, and that's often the case when you ask. Or in some really egregious instances, they have switched secondary and primary outcomes because it just makes the study look better. So for these papers, we already go back to the author and say, no, you must report it as according to protocol if we were to consider it any further. So what do we look for? And I'm saying now negative. So we are screening out poor research practices. And if there's a poor question to start with, or an inappropriate patient group, or an inappropriate endpoint, that cannot be improved. So we would go back to the authors and say, no, we're not interested for that reason. If there's a lack of comparator group for the Lancet, that would be also something that we would not further consider. If it's underpowered, or if it's inconclusive because there are too few participants, we would also not consider that. I'm not saying this shouldn't be published somewhere, because if it's clearly, transparently said that this is underpowered, or there were too few participants, and that can be part of the research evidence, but it doesn't give you the full evidence at this point, then it can be published somewhere, but this is just not something we would consider. Or if, very often authors, especially of negative trials, would rely on exploratory analysis or sort of other ad hoc, post hoc analysis. And again, that's something we are very wary of. But in this instance, we would perhaps go back to the authors and say, no, just report it honestly. Report it as a negative trial. Don't go into your post hoc analysis or so on. And I think that often means that we publish it actually honestly, rather than we reject it, it goes to some other journals, and they spin their data there. For predictive tools, we would need validation in an independent cohort. If there's no protocol, and so on, if there's retrospective trial registration, we would also reject a paper now, especially if there's no good explanation. Sometimes authors come back with reasonably good explanations. It's only a month, somebody in the administration has made a mistake. But then we would look at this, and say, okay, in this particular instance, we would perhaps still go with it. Salami slicing or Me Too studies, again, Me Too studies is just not for the Lancet. There can be somewhere else. Reproducibility is important. But salami slicing, we go back to authors. And we've had a paper just 2 days ago where they presented us 3 trials. But it was, when you looked at the protocol, it was just one trial, and they presented all the various outcomes as different trials. So we went back and said, no, we're interested in this if you present it in full as it was planned, but not like this. This is poor practice. Let me say a little bit about peer review, and I think the speaker coming after me will say a little more about peer review. But I think, peer review is dependent on editors' selection of peer reviewers. And I've done this now for many, many, many years. And I can select, peer reviewers who I would know, oh, they will just wave this through. So, or I can select some that I know, because out of experience, they're hypercritical. So I think what is important here is that editors' interpretation and selection of peer review plays a much larger role than people usually think. It's not like, we get 3 or 4 peer reviewers, 2 say reject and 2 say major, and then we reject it. No, we look very carefully, why do these peer reviewers say reject? And very often they say, oh, this isn't good enough for the Lancet. So I say, well, sorry, that's not your decision, that's our decision. Or they say reject because, they haven't done this and this analysis, but then we can ask for this analysis. So I think it's interesting peer review, because it's often seen as, oh, these are these experts, that give their comments and for free, and there's more to that, that needs interpretation, it needs further discussion. And this is where I also always answer about, why don't you publish your peer review comments? What we don't publish, though, then, is all the discussions that we have in between. So every single paper gets discussed in a group of 35 editors who look at all these peer review comments. And if you wanted the full picture, you would have to record this session and then come out with our decision. It's also important to choose peer reviewers, that are diverse, and that's getting quite difficult, I have to say. We do this always for expertise and geography, and we've done for a long time, but we also want to now do it for seniority and for gender, ethnicity, but that is a very, very difficult way of doing it, and takes a lot of time to find the right people. So for seniority, we have encouraged every peer reviewer that we contact, please involve one of your more junior researchers in that peer review and name him or her. And that has actually led to quite a lot of extra expertise and extra involvement of younger researchers in an open way. Because often, I think, in the past, what has happened, you asked a senior peer reviewer, and they just give it to their PhD to do, but that person was never named or acknowledged. So I think editors' interpretation of the peer review is really, really important. And we all know it's peer review week this week, as we speak, and the main theme of peer review is research integrity. Unfortunately, I think peer review is very poor in detecting proper problems with research integrity, such as fraud and fabrication. It's really, really difficult, I think. So a little bit on editors as guardians of the scientific record, and this is going away from, encouraging responsible research, but dealing with actual errors, misconduct. So what we have is corrections, expressions of concerns, retractions and republications and retractions to correct the scientific record. And that's the only purpose of these things. So, if there's an error that can be easily corrected, we would do that immediately. Expressions of concern are a difficult area, because this is where we have a good idea that something major has gone wrong with a published paper, but that the investigation will take a very long time to come out with a result. And it's important for readers, for public health reasons or other reasons, to actually know that something is wrong with that particular research. Together with JAMA, a few years ago, we have started retractions and republication. And this is for cases where actually there was an honest error, but it's changed the results completely. And you couldn't do a simple correction. We would just have to republish a whole paper. And in these instances, we would retract the paper and republish a new paper after peer review again and explain what has happened. And I think that's a good practice because it also shows that this retraction is not, is not a punishment of the authors. It's just something that you have to do to get unreliable, non-valid research out of the public domain. And then there are retractions for misconduct. We have Retraction Watch that has now got a fantastic database of retractions, and I think that's an important resource. COPE has published these retraction guidelines. It's the lead editors through the steps of what to do with retractions. But it's a complicated process, and every time this happens, it takes a very long time. It's dependent on the institutional investigation, unless it's plagiarism, which we can see ourselves. Real falsification, we cannot investigate. It's the institution that needs to investigate. And these often take a very, very long time. And journals are sometimes blamed that it takes a very, very long time. But institutions often take a very, very long time too. And they go through all sorts of processes and legal ramifications and so on. There's stigma associated with retractions, and sometimes journals even have been confronted with legal threats, although I think there are a couple of exceptions, but in general, they haven't really won through, I think. So these collaborations between journals or editors and institutions is really quite a difficult area. And this is where we had a few years ago the CLUE workshop, which CLUE stands for Collaboration and Liaison Between Universities and Editors. And that was organized together by EMBO and COPE. And we've since enhanced that with a group of US research integrity officers and editors. And there's a preprint out there on OSF, and I have this also clickable for you afterwards, and you can look at that. And this was led by Susan Garfinkel from the US, because with the US, it's particularly difficult. So they wouldn't even kind of speak to us, They wouldn't, if we have an allegation, not an allegation, but if we have, for example, a peer reviewer that says, these data look too good to be true. That does happen sometimes. Then we go back to the peer review and we say, what do you mean by that? And then they give a little bit more explanation. But then we need to very quickly hand that on to the institution. And if that happens in the US, they immediately shut down. And they also say we cannot contact the author first, because that's actually good practice, and that's what is fair, and that's what editors would do. But they are very against that, because then the author could get, or the researcher could go away and dispose of all their data and then claim nothing has happened or they've lost it. So we've come out with this enhancing partnerships of institutions and journals, a US perspective or best practice, where we explore that further. And one of the main recommendations in there, and this is great, I think, if that would really be coming to fruition, is that we separate out the culpability, because that's what the institutions are interested in, versus the validity of the scientific record. So that we can very quickly retract a paper, say, this scientific record is unreliable or not valid, but we don't say this is because X, Y, and Z have done this, because we just give the facts of the not valid data, and then the institution carries on their own investigation into culpability, misconduct, which are more human resources sort of type issues. And I think if we go down that route, that would speed up the correction of the scientific record enormously. We were learning from each retraction also at journals. So at each time a retraction happens, we have a sort of, morbidity and mortality kind of discussion, as we would in medicine say, where we sit together, go through all this, science. So were there any signs at peer review that we should have picked up and we haven't picked up? What was the issue? And one of our most important retractions, unfortunately, 2 years ago or so, was on a COVID paper, and the NEJM had to retract a paper as well at the same time very quickly. And this was a paper that used a commercial database that turned out to be non-existent. And they were in conjunction with academic authors. So what we then learned from this particular retraction was that in future we would not publish a paper where nobody has any experience with that particular database. So somebody needs to have had experience or looked at this database, either as a peer reviewer or even one of the other authors need to, and in addition, two of the other authors, the academic authors, would have had access to this database and verified it. But so you can learn from each retraction, and we've done that in the past where we, for example, had a Norwegian researcher fabricating data that we then said, okay, from now on, every paper from a particular country needs to have a reviewer out of that country too. So, and that would have told us in that particular old case that the database the researcher claimed the data from wasn't open at that point. So let me now turn to editors as educators of researchers. And what we can do here is we can write about it. And I think we've written editorials about it. We are following, obviously, the World Conferences of Research Integrity very closely with my involvement. Nature has also editorialized many times about it, and I think that's great because people then will take notice. And we heard about Europe's vision for, reforming research assessment already from one of the previous speakers, and I think that's a great improvement, and it's, as journals, we can point these things out. We can publish about it, and Malcolm has mentioned this morning, the research waste series that we published in The Lancet in 2014, and in a way I'm quite keen to sort of do a follow-up on that at some point. Malcolm, I speak to you later over dinner, because I think that was quite a landmark series. And then we can get involved beyond publications. We can get involved like with the Hong Kong principles. And I see somebody's coming onto the stage. I have 2 more slides because I want to give you now my most provocative 2 slides at the end. And I've circled the open science, where I say open science as a solution. I think it is, I'm all for open science, and it definitely strengthens responsible research. It's transparency of research planning, data scrutiny, open decision-making, easy accessibility, immediately usable for policy making and further. We all know these positives, and you'd all agree with that, and I do too. What I think we don't talk enough about is that this is a business model that encourages 2 things that I'm completely against. One is, again, you all would agree, predatory journals, but it's also publishers now go for quantity over quality. And we've seen some quite astonishing, news that PLOS ONE had to retract more than 100 papers because of rigged peer review and guest editors and so on. So I think, there's sort of, we need to do more as editors and journals to do adding value and quality control, but that costs money and somebody has to pay for it. There's also inequity in publishing for open science, but we can talk about that later. So I will skip over that. I want to give you my take-home messages, and from jury I've learned I should have had some color in some of them, so please imagine green and red and orange. So I think editors can do a lot to screen for sloppy research and improve poorly presented papers. And as guardian of the scientific record, we need to act responsibly and as fast as possible in collaboration with institutions. Everyone, including editors, can talk and educate about responsible research practices. And I think open science is a very important movement for research integrity, but the unintended negatives are not enough recognized and addressed. Thank you very much for your
attention. Thank you. We have some time for a few questions. So, Mara, go ahead.
I've 2 kind of related questions, Sabine. One is about this difficulty of papers living on in the blogosphere beyond the publisher websites. And I've seen some analysis of papers that were retracted anything up to 12 years ago, still being available outside of the publisher's websites on the internet without the retraction label. Is there anything being done in that instance to try and identify them? Because somebody finding them offline is not going to know that they've been retracted necessarily.
Yeah, I think, I don't know where they would be. I mean, we make very sure that we follow the guidelines with, which need to be very specific, that you have retraction in the headline of the actual retraction, you watermark the PDF, and you link, all the way through, and that way it says that on PubMed. Whether somebody's downloaded it beforehand on a private website and it's still there, I would encourage everyone just to look on PubMed, what's happening to a particular paper before citing it or doing anything with it.
Yeah, and you did touch on this, that idea that you just write retracted, you don't actually go into the details. And yet, I wonder, would there be a benefit from understanding why an article has been retracted?
We would give details, but only on the facts, why the research is not valid, not on who did it and why that person did it.
Yuri, I need you. Malcolm.
Sorry.
So I comment and a question. The comment is that the oligopoly of journal publishing makes my heart is bleeding with the thought that someone needs to pay for something, given how much we all pay to get published in all of these journals. It's not as if publishers were short of funds. What I'm interested, so that's the comment. What I'm interested in is this idea that a US institution might come back to you and say, you can't tell the author because they might say the dog ate their homework, which implies that they believe, and you believe, that they don't have a data processing pipeline which they have confidence in its ability to retain information. Which is to say, in shorthand, the Lancet is publishing clinical trials for which the provenance of the raw data cannot be assured. Is that fair?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that, but I mean, the raw data obviously are kept at the institution, and, we now would actually, if the data cannot be produced at the journal, we would still retract, because we would say, well, if you can't show us that you have these data for whatever reason, then we have no trust in these data.
Why don't you ask for the data at the time of article submission? Because that would be current best practice.
I think that is possible for some types of research. I think it's not possible for other types of research. And what would we do with it? We still firmly believe that the data belong to the institution where they are, kept. And I think institutions need to do a lot more to have data repositories that everybody can look at after a paper has been published.
All right. Final question.
Thank you. Bart Koes from Rotterdam. Can I ask your opinion about the power that editors have? Sometimes if you submit a paper, you get, reviewers' comments, and then you adjust it, and then in the end, it's the editor is still not satisfied and proposes another conclusion or another interpretation of the data. And of course, you want to publish in the Lancet and in New England and so, and then you give in. But actually, you don't agree with the editor, but yeah, you have all the power. So what do you think of that?
Well, yes, I can't deny that we have some power, in this kind of system.
You're the most powerful woman in this audience today.
Thank you. But as professional editors, what we really want to do is we want research to be presented as honestly and transparently as possible. So while you might interpret maybe your study by your post hoc analysis, I am just not, I will say, you've planned it with this particular primary outcome, that primary outcome is negative. Yes, your post hoc analysis you've done may be hypothesis generating, but that's not your conclusion.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for allowing us I was going to say thank you very much for allowing us a peek into a journal's kitchen, as it were. Much appreciated. Our next speaker